So we have an extremely exciting lineup of speakers today to talk about the role of the finance sector in supporting responsible agribusiness. And as you can see, our agenda is very full with expert speakers from across different stakeholder groups, including speakers from USAID, Green Invest Asia, Mizuho Bank, Oxfam, Grow Asia, and OECD. Next slide, please. Now, before we start with our presentations, I should emphasise that you will have the chance to ask questions to each of our speakers and at the end in the panel discussion. The green arrow on the right shows you where you can put your questions to send to any one of our presenters today. If you would like to address your question to a specific speaker, you can put their name in brackets. And some of you may not be able to see this toolbox on your screen. Don't worry, just click the orange arrow at the top where the red arrow is pointing to on the left there, and that should maximize your toolbox so that you can see your question box. Now, if you have any technical issues, you can send a question to Pranav in the question box. You can try logging on and off, and you can also send an email to pranav@growasia.org. Next slide, please. Okay, we actually have 350 plus. Last count was 399 people registered for this webinar. So let's find out what stakeholder groups are attending alongside you today. So I'm going to ask Pranav, our technical maestro, he's already done it, to launch our quick poll, and I want you to all select within the next 10 seconds what best describes the organisation you work for or represent. And then Pranav's going to launch that. Oh, look. Okay, so we've got a very good mix there. Very strong NGO, CSO representation, and also from the private sector, the agribusiness sector. We've also got government and financial institutions. And we also have probably, well, we've got 155 people with us so far. So many more to come. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so moving on with our agenda, I'd like to introduce Shivani Kanabaran, from the Agricultural Sector Lead from OECD Centre for Responsible Business Conduct. Shivani?
Thank you very much, Alison. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning. I'm speaking to you from Paris today. We've got a pretty global team behind this webinar. I want to take the opportunity, first of all, to really have a big thank you to both Grow Asia and WOMAG. We couldn't have done this without them. This is a real collaborative effort. I also do want to take a time to thank both the European Union as well as the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, who are funders of our work, of all these organizations. Next slide, please. Just wanted to take a few minutes to put a little bit of context as to why we are doing this. At the OECD, we work on a whole range of issues, as many of you know, from taxation to competition, but also on investment, and in particular on what it means to have responsible investment. And within that, we look very much at the concepts of what does it mean to be a responsible business in today's world. We have a number of guidelines that actually help frame this. And these are guidelines that have been elaborated with and developed with, of course, governments, so OECD governments in the main, but also non-OECD members, large economies, for example, with business, with groups like civil society, as well as workers. So we have quite a comprehensive, broad approach to how we develop standards on responsible business conduct. One of the key concepts that we talk about, and this has been happening since about 2010 or so, is this idea of due diligence and what does this mean? So we've come out through the OECD FAO guidance, and this again, another important consideration is the fact that we've worked together with other international organizations, and in food and agriculture, certainly the FAO is the organization that we turn to. And what we've done together with FAO is to develop a global framework to help companies along the whole value chain really identify, understand, and react and mitigate what I would call environmental, social, governance type risks in the supply chain. We're looking at the full value chain here. So this includes, of course, agricultural investors. And that's what the purpose of today's webinar is all about. And of course, we understand that producers and farmers are the primary investors, but this also includes financial institutions. So we wanted to deepen this understanding a little bit, and we've invited a stellar panel today to speak to you about it, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. I think for me personally, one of the things I'm really interested in hearing from panelists is to really understand from you, what are the specific actions or signals that business can give to the investor community to show that they are responsible and doing the right thing? How can they demonstrate that? I mean, we have our views on that, but I'd be very interested to hear from our speakers today about that. Finally, I think we're all, teleworking from many fragmented different parts of the world, and I think we need to also think through a little bit the post-COVID world and what does this mean? What are some of the risks that we are all going to be facing? I strongly believe that our OECD FAO guidance has actually highlighted a number of these things, from health and safety, worker rights, even pathogen crossovers, and the broader issues of the environment, sustainable use of resources, natural resources, and biodiversity. Anyway, I don't want to take too much time. We've got a great panel ahead of us, so I'm going to end here. Thank you again to all our partners. And as you know, these slides will be shared widely after the webinar, so you'll have a chance. And of course, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate. Alison, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shivani, for the excellent introduction. And I'd like to move on to and introduce Christy Owen, who serves as the Chief of Party for USAID Green Invest Asia. And Christy will be telling us about the roles and barriers for finance in investing in sustainable agriculture. Welcome, Christy.
Thank you so much. First of all, again, my name is Christy. I'm the Chief of Party for USAID Green Invest Asia, which is a technical assistance facility implemented by PACT and in partnership with Mekong Strategic Partners. I really do appreciate the invitation from Grow Asia and OECD to be part of this panel. So just to get started, if I could get to the next slide. You click next slide. Yep, great. So by way of a quick overview, the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID Green Invest Asia, is a platform that provides technical and advisory services to investors and business in the agricultural and forestry sectors. The investment required to decrease greenhouse gases, or GHG emissions, from commercial land use, which is responsible for about 40% of all emissions in Asia, cannot come from public finance alone. So our aim is to increase investment by about $400 million into agricultural and forestry businesses whose operations and practices slow, stop, and or reverse loss of forests and other landscapes. And as a result, we expect a GHG reduction, avoidance, or sequestration of about 25 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So we aim to achieve our KPIs through two ways. First is pipeline development with a focus on financial and social environmental outcomes. Our expertise in environmental, social, and governance for responsible investment is available through technical and advisory services to act as a matchmaker and connect businesses with investors and investors with business in Cambodia, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand. Second, we work to address more systemic barriers to finance, such as improving ESG among local and regional banks, specifically when it comes to land use lending. So while we are not investing our own funds through the Green Invest Asia platform, we are identifying and evaluating investments for dozens of financial institutions and investors active in the Southeast Asia region. So it's from those engagements and conversations that are going to inform my comments today. As a quick note, I do acknowledge that there is a difference between type of investors: banks, impact funds, equity funds. And so the role and challenges for banks who look at cash flow and securities are going to be a bit different than from the role and challenges for equity impact investors who are looking at medium to long-term ROIs and business profitability. So in that regard, my remarks are a bit more general in nature, with perhaps a leaning towards banks. So I have the next slide, please. So what can be done from the financial sector to drive responsible supply chains? On a whole, the financial sector reacts to market changes. It's not necessarily driving them. So while investors may not be able to lead the development of responsible ag companies, they can give clear signals about priorities and create incentives for responsible ag companies, or forestry companies for that matter, through their financial products and investment criteria, which help support sustainable supply chains. One example of creating incentives through financial products are sustainability-linked loans. and I know Jay Wise is going to speak more about this. Over the past couple of years, we've seen some examples emerge, such as through financial leaders like ING and BNP Paribas with large multinationals like Wilmar and Olam. These loans tie interest rates to performance on an agreed set of environmental and social indicators, often using a third-party service such as Sustainalytics to help set up and verify. This model is encouraging as it connects a key incentive, dollars, with sustainability. For Asia, the next step could be expanding this financial product to SMEs, an underserved segment of the green finance marketplace. To help move in that direction, we've produced guidelines on sustainability-linked loans, specifically for FIs interested in such a product. Second, financial institutions can add GHG emissions into their investment criteria to more fully understand the environmental and social impacts of their portfolio. These days, knowing your carbon footprint is less a good to know and more of a must know. We see movement beyond simply knowing your direct operational footprint, scope 1 and 2, to understanding the indirect footprint of an investment portfolio, scope 3. Recently, USA Green Invest Asia began a partnership with Rabo Foundation to pilot a carbon accounting tool, Cool Farm tool, for their lending portfolio in Indonesia. This is Rabo Foundation's first portfolio level carbon accounting methodology pilot that is expected to be scaled across its portfolio. Rabo Foundation wants to know attributable GHG emissions for its 2019 investments. From the results, it will be able to integrate emissions from investments into sustainability reports, but also evaluate the impact of total emissions on their portfolio in balance with investments that sequester emissions. So Rabo Foundation is signaling the importance of minimizing carbon emissions from their clients, by their clients, as part of a business model and its decision-making, linking that to decision-making. So next slide, please. So my last slide has a couple of thoughts on challenges for investment. I think we can agree that there are several barriers. For example, land title and legality of concessions are a major risk for investors, particularly on indigenous people's lands, community managed lands, or close to protected areas. But this is also not necessarily something that is in the manageable control of the investor. So I focus on just 3 that we have consistently found to be a barrier for investing in the ag and forestry as sectors for which there is a course of action by the investor. First is understanding the agricultural and forestry sectors themselves. So the challenge of risk aversion is connected to an ability to accurately identify and thus manage those risks. There is unfortunately a bit of an investor culture mindset that has long regarded land as high risk and maybe not worth the effort. This can be in part because most investors have a limited knowledge to invest in agroforestry, especially in the Asia context if they're external to Asia themselves. And the ag sector is broad and requires a wide range of expertise, right? Dairy is different than vegetables, is different than aquaculture, especially when it comes to assessing the E&S risks of these companies. So we've put together some guidelines, ESG guidelines specific for key commodities in the Southeast Asia region that investors, particularly banks, can use to help them identify and understand the risks with land-based investments and thus be able to more wisely tap into a multi-billion-dollar green investment opportunity. Second is support for smallholders. One of the most common things we've heard over the past few years is that in Southeast Asia, smallholders are a stumbling block for investors. Smallholder farms are an integral part of the supply chain for almost any commodity in the region, thus any large buyer or processor must engage. However, there are unique challenges farmers face in relation to cash flow, collateral, and capacity. Smallholder microfinance interest rates on loans are often too expensive or loan tenures too short for harvest cycles and ag production returns. One strategy we've been exploring with larger buyers and processors, such as Barry Callebaut, as well as some financial institutions, are business models that promote intercropping of different crops, shifting away from monocrop models. The intended result being more resilience on the part of the farmer and a more sustainable and reliable supply chain. A second strategy we've been exploring is specific to smallholder finance. Over the past 3 months and in partnership with Financial Access, SNV, and Hevia Connect, we've been assessing the feasibility of a smallholder rubber finance fund. The main objective of this study was to gather and analyze financial data of smallholder rubber farms to assess whether it's possible to create a financial mechanism to provide loans to smallholders to replant rubber trees. Based on these findings, a proof of concept financing model has been designed to structure and channel diverse funding sources through local financial institutions to smallholders rubber replanting loans. We're expecting to release this study and structure conversations with interested parties for the purpose of moving to the next steps in the next couple months. And finally, and somewhat tied to the first, are what we've referred to as environmental and social fundamentals. right? So ESG commitments are honored in other SDG sectors, namely renewable energy, but it can be really hard to even pry money out of dedicated green funds whose express purpose is to cut carbon emissions. In about 2018, less than 5% of green bonds were raised for sustainable land use, which includes ag. So typical investors still look at business fundamentals before the ENS sustainability. ENS sustainability is viewed as a plus, but not necessarily a real requirement. And for most investors are still what are considered the first phase in ENS development, reactive management. The next phase is about incorporating ENS values at the same level as other business fundamentals. So as a bit of a positive, before I end, the pressure is increasing on investors to better assess the sustainability of their investments and report it. And these requirements are increasing from the regulators, customers, and shareholders. And so with that, I will stop. I think I'm probably about up on my time, but I'm happy to respond to any questions. Thank you.
Great.
Over.
Great, thanks, Christy. Incredibly interesting, and I'm sure there's many questions already coming in on your presentation. So just a reminder, everyone, if you have a question you would like to ask Christy, just put it in the question box and we will collect them and ask her those questions at the end of the next presentation. Who I'd like to introduce now. So if we can next slide, we have JY Chow, Food, Beverage and Agricultural Sector Coverage Lead from Mizuho Bank. JY, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alison. Hi, everyone. I'm JY Chow. So I'm covering the food and agriculture sectors at Mizuho Bank for Asia out of Singapore. So first of all, I would like to thank Grow Asia and OECD for inviting me to cover a topic that I'm personally very engaged. So within the 8 minutes, I plan to give an overview on green loan and more specifically about the sustainability linked loan, or what we call the environmental, social, and corporate governance linked loan, ESG. As you probably know, the ESG loan have been becoming very popular financial instruments, and my plan is to tell you what it is about and why it is growing so fast, and share a case study more specifically, right? So on that slide that you can see, to frame that topic, right, here's a snapshot of the overall impact on financing landscape. So on the top of the slide, it's what I would call the sustainability purpose, right? This is all the different vehicles what you can definitely make an impact on terms of sustainability, right? This is what we call the actionable, right? At the bottom part, it's what we have in terms of financial mediums or instrument to support it, right? And the one we highlighted here is the debt part, right? And especially the green loan, right? For us, for instance, at Mizuho, we don't do microfinancings or retail banking outside of Japan. So our way to have impact through the value chain is through our clients which deal with the food and agri value chain, right? So let's move to the next slide, please. So if you zoom into the debt, it was primarily through green bonds, right? If you see on the left side, the dark purple was the amount of green bonds that have been issued from the last 5 years. So it was really since 2018 that the fastest expanding segment was the ESG linked loan, right? And I will go right on details why is that. This allowed more meaningful way to change and incentivize the company's long-term commitment to sustainability. So moving to the next slide, please. So 2018, as I mentioned, was really a pivotal years for the ESG linked loan. And this is for 3 reasons, right? First, because Asia set a framework for green loan principle. So it was giving a reference of how to deal with that new product. And secondly, the ESG linked loan gained a lot of visibilities, right? We see more deals with landmark names in the agri space. And then that was also one of the key triggers, right? And third, quite important is I mean, both lenders and borrowers got comfortable with ESG-linked loan. There's a lot of educational process from both sides. Both bankers and the lenders need to have a common agreement on that, right? So moving to the next slide, please. If we want to clarify what is a green loan and sustainability linked loan, because very often we have asked this question: what's the main difference between the three type of green loans, right? So here in that table, you see the green bonds on the left, and what we call the GLP compliant green loans, green loan principal loan, and on the right, the sustainability linked loan, right? I will definitely not go in details one by one on that table, but in short, the main difference, it's the proceed of the funding, right? If you do a green bonds or green loan principles, loan proceeds have to be utilized for eligible green projects, which have clear inventable benefits. So by saying that, it's a bit problematic for lenders in the way that you are not able to match your funding needs and the size of the project. So there was a lot of hurdle for some players to were willing to do green financing, but actually the product was probably not matching the needs, right? So that's why the ESG linked loan come up with a different approach. The use of the funding can be for general corporate needs or CapEx, and is linking the loan terms, namely the interest rate margins, to a sustainability performance target, such as ESG ratings. So I will go to the next slide and you will see the details. So you can move to the next slide. So concretely, it is incentivized loan, ESG linked loan, meaning that your loan interest costs reduce if you improve your sustainability score, ESG rating. Meaning that, for instance, Mizuho will agree to give a potential discounts on your interest rate if you achieve a ESG goal that we agree on, right? So when I mentioned that, it's really important to understand the approach, right? What matters is the improvement on sustainability, right? And not your current level in which you are. So basically that concept is inviting everyone to raise the bars from point A to B. And the ESG linked loan sustainability performance ratings is only disclosed to lenders. So that's also give a level of comfort for lenders in a way that regardless of where they are on the journey to sustainabilities, what is important is the way how they improve themselves and how we as a bank or a group of banks can incentivize it, right? So the performance rating is based on a third-party agency, either from a ESG framework and or a policy agency or a new one, right? So you lower your interest rate according to ESG performance, right? So this is really the approach. On the top right charts, I'll put some figures to help you to see concretely how it means, right? So if you have a facility size of 500 millions and you have a saving of 7.5 basis points per annum, this is concretely the saving you can make if you discounted your cost of your ESG ratings cost, which is about 30,000 per annum, but it can vary. But on yearly basis for a 500 million loan, the saving could be roughly about 350,000, right? Which is quite substantial, right? Now I will just go quickly on that example in our case for Mizuho, right? So this is quite an interesting case because at the bottom, I show actually two transactions to the same clients to show the evolution of ESG linked loan. So the client is Indorama Venture Public Company Limited, IVL. It's a world-leading chemical company specialized in PET packaging, mainly used in beverage industry. So back in 2018, we had several rounds of meetings, both internally and externally, to help them familiarize with the concept and the new product, right? And in April 2019, we started with a bilateral deal. It was the first ESG-linked loan in Thailand, and really helped both IVL and Mizio to put us
I'm sorry to
on the map.
interrupt you, but it's time. So if you could wrap
Right.
up in 30 seconds, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. I think that was last slide I was covering. So I mean, if you want to summarize, it's also about visibility that you want to give to your clients and ourselves. And it's also a new way of funding. It gives diversifications of sourcings. For example, the second deal was actually using some funding coming from Japan in US dollars. So I mean, overall, the ESG linked loan is a new product and it's developing quite rapidly. I'll stop from now.
Okay, great. And thank you for that very detailed and informative presentation. And I know you had a slide there just in case for any COVID type questions. So if you could just forward the slide to the next one. And we're into our questions and comments section. So this is when we welcome back Christy, and JY stays. He can take a little bit of a breath because I'm going to ask the first question to Christy. And if you do have any questions, just make sure you put it in the question box and we can ask our two experts. So Christy, I have some questions for you. Perhaps the first one is around your two targets that you set for your program. For example, to increase private sector investment by 400 million by 2022. We're interested in how close are you to reaching that target? And with regards to your second target, investors improve their land use practices and reduce carbon emissions by 25 million metric tonnes. Is that target ambitious enough? So two meaty questions there for you to answer. And perhaps, yeah, you go for it, Christy.
Go for it. Okay, so thank you so much for the questions. For the first target, we are about halfway through year 3, so we have a couple more years to go. I'll be honest, we're not as close as I would like to be. I think we are about $30 million into our target. That said, one of the things I have learned is that this is not a fast process. It takes months and sometimes in the magnitude of a year or more to be able to connect and negotiate. So I'm hopeful that our pipeline and some interest is enough that target, you'll see that change in the next year as things start to really come together. The second one about the carbon emissions, is that target ambitious enough? In part, it depends on what commodities we're talking about. So if we were slowly, for some commodities like coffee or cacao, we find that we get less carbon emissions, But certainly if we were for forestry, for acacia, for teak, the potential is much greater. It also depends a lot on scale and size. So we are trying to target mid-sized businesses, established businesses that have the potential for scale, that are in that kind of missing middle of finance. So, I think we're going to make that target and actually potentially exceed it. However, a lot of it depends on market demand and investor interest, which we cannot control.
Okay, great answer, and thank you for that. JY, I have a question here. For ESG loans in land use sectors, how do you deal with the cost for A, assessing historical land clearing practices affecting the communities and the environment, and monitoring and reporting on loan compliance after disbursement? Who pays for these studies and costs of compliance?
Right, that's the questions, right? So that would be the lender who pay it, right? So that's sort of an upfront cost that you have when you do this loan, right? But when you look back on the chart, you can see that the cost of overall is quite small on the savings, assuming you achieve your target.
Okay, and here's a general question as well. Perhaps you could answer this well as JY. Are the ESG rating groups, are they aligned in their methodology of rating, and are these ratings linked and aligned to global frameworks from the UN, OECD, ILO, for example? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a difficult part, right? Definitely, I always think the ratings could be different from one agency to another's, and actually, it's not a bad thing in a way that the ratings also need to be adapted to what is important for the company itself to improve their sustainabilities, right? From one company to another's, we may want to put some more weight on different ratings. And that's a discussion that you may have with agencies at the end to see what's the leverage you want the company to move in the directions.
Excellent, thanks JY. Christy, I remember you saying something like you cannot manage what is not measured, and there's a push to increase capacity to measure the carbon footprint of investments. You gave an example with Rabobank. How far away do you think we are from measurement of carbon footprint of investment becoming a business as usual step in agricultural investment decision making?
Good question. I'm afraid maybe not close enough. I think there's still a ways to go. When we speak to investors and banks about this, it's for a variety of reasons understandable. It's not high on their list. There's some out there like Bravo, like some other Dutch investors and Dutch banks that have placed a premium on understanding their GHG emissions because they have it as part of their sustainability goals, and so they are reporting on it and they see a value in that. But I think for others, it's still a bit of a climb. I'm certainly hopeful that with kind of the new current situation that people will understand and value a bit more and try to measure a bit more their impact on environment, how their investments and how their contributions kind of go towards the greater good, and then make more of an effort to engage, because there are tools out there that do enable companies and investors to make these kinds of calculations and take these measurements.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Christy. And JY, now that you've had a bit of a rest, I'm going to ask you another question. Since banks provide more capital than impact funds and DFIs, how can more banks be enticed to migrate their loan books to capture ESG criteria and compliance?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think it's a bit of supply and demand, right? I think the situation right now is we see banks moving in that directions. I think there's still a lot of educational process to be done toward our clients. I think our clients are still wondering of how practically it can work. Some are also wondering which currency can work for them. So I think going forward, we see the popularizations of a product because it's a new financial product, and we hope that the market will continue to pick up on that.
Thank you, JY. And Christy, I mean, this is something a little bit along the same lines, but how do you think international organisations like OECD and FAO can engage with investors better to provide more clarity on these ESG issues facing the agri sector?
Yeah, good. I think I definitely think there is a role. I think that's part of this coming together of public and private. A lot of research and understanding and technical know-how available in the public sector through like the FAO and through other research organizations. Part of it is, we've said this before, it's kind of about speaking the same language. From a very personal experience coming from a development background, I've had a steep learning curve in my education in working with the private sector in finance and trying to understand how they communicate, what resonates, what the incentives are. I think that, providing themselves as service providers, we do actually through Green Invest Asia use kind of trusted knowledge centers to help work with some of the companies and the investors. So we're trying to also demonstrate that and create that trust and credibility between the two.
Excellent, thanks, Christy. I've got a question for you, JY. Do you think there is a need for more public disclosure in the use of when using green financing options? It was pointed out that 2 of your loan options, there's a requirement for public disclosure to lenders only. Can you give your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think it's a good point regarding public disclosures. I think the reality is it's a sensitive part because actually a lot of companies, in terms of how they manage sustainabilities, there's a bit of IP in that sense. There's few things that they may not disclose to competitors. So that's why, as of now, a lot of these ESG linked the disclosures of the ratings and the way of the valuations is only disclosed to the lenders and not to a public. And that's also one thing that helped the popularity of the ESG, right? It helped you to move to the right directions without disclosing publicly. And I know it sounds a bit counterproductive in that way, but they also believe that there's some know-how on how you improve your sustainability as well.
Excellent, thank you. I've got one more question perhaps I can squeeze into the session. Thank you, JY. Christy, for you, somebody has asked, may I know if there's any intention to support palm oil smallholder farmers too?
We have the ability to do that. We don't have any active opportunities that we're looking at, but it is a possibility. We remain open to Syria. A lot of it, again, depends on, we look at the business, we look at how an investor would be involved, and kind of also the ability for trying to promote sustainable practices. So there's a lot of kind of factors in there, but the short answer is we would look at it.
Excellent. Thank you, Christy, and thank you, JY. And that is the end of your question and comment section. You are off the hot seat. You can rest and relax for a little while until we come back for our panel discussion. And so goodbye to you. You can turn your screens off and relax there. And I'd like to introduce our third speaker, Imke Greven, who works as a land rights policy advisor with Oxfam. And she is presenting today on the role of the financial sector in land-related conflicts and human rights violations. Welcome, Imke, to the webinar.
Thank you very much, Alice. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. I am based in the Netherlands, so for me it's morning. And as I only have like 8 minutes, I will go into it straight away. Can you please go to the next slide? I would like to start with like setting the scene a little bit related to land rights. So 1/3 of the world, which is around 2.5 billion people, depend on land and natural resources for their daily survival. They protect more than 50% of the world's land surface, but only have a recognized right over 10% of it. So to give an example, since 2000, 70 million hectares have changed hands through large-scale land acquisitions. This is data you can look up at the land matrix. If I put some hyperlinks on the slide. And research has shown that 93% of land concessions have been inhabited. So without secured land rights, this leaves people vulnerable for losing access to land, for example, when land is acquired for agricultural purposes. Unfortunately, it's also a very risky area. A report from Global Witness last year highlighted that agribusiness is the riskiest sector for environmental and land rights defenders, as this industry has seen the highest rate of killings happening or taking place. Next slide, please. So what is the link to the financial sector? And as mentioned before, the financial sector is very broad. As Christy also mentioned, and we can think of banks, but we can also think of pension funds, insurance companies, developing banks. Relating to pension funds, we did a scoping research where we had 25 controversial cases of land-related human rights violations. And you can think of also including water grabbing or land evictions or environmental pollution, for example. And it was identified that 32 stock-listed companies were involved in these cases. And for the selected pension funds for this scoping research, investment in 22 of these selected companies were found. On this slide, I've picked an example of the Fair Finance Guide International, and you might know it, but the Fair Finance Guide is also in Japan, in Indonesia, in Thailand, and in India. And in this particular case, there are 9 insurance groups active in the Netherlands who have invested in 10 controversial palm oil companies through shares or bonds or through the management of assets of third parties. So even though deforestation and land-related conflicts are an ongoing risk in the palm oil sector, it turns out that most insurance groups show that they have a lack of transparency regarding how they address deforestation or land grabbing in this high-risk sector. On a positive note, there are also examples of insurance companies that show that it is possible to take substantial action and to be transparent. Because without transparency, it's really hard to hold investors accountable. Next slide, please. I would like to elaborate a little bit on the importance of free prior informed consent. So a community's choice to give or withhold their free prior informed consent to a project or an activity that is planned on their land is a recognized right for indigenous peoples under international law. In addition, it's also a best practice principle that applies to all communities affected by projects or activities that take place on their land. A recommendation, for example, by Olivier de Schutter, who was then Special Rapporteur on the right to food, he said that in principle that any shifts in land use can only take place with the free prior informed consent of local communities involved. Increasingly, the banking sector has recognized the importance of free prior informed consent. It is incorporated at least in part of guidelines and standards, and it's also part of the human rights responsibilities and obligations of banks under the United Nations Guiding Principles. Linking to what Shivani mentioned earlier, FPIC helps in identifying risks. So conducting an FPIC process next to it being a right for indigenous peoples, it also helps to avoid risks such as land-related fraud, corruption, money laundering, murder, threats, sexual violence, whatsoever. The importance, of course, lies also with the implementation. So in August 2019, we have published a report, the Oxfam, on what banks must do to put commitments on free prior informed consent into practice. And it gives examples of concrete actions that banks can take to get started on operationalizing FPIC. So if we go to the next slide, to go one step back, so about financial institutions, I have listed 6 keywords on this slide. So what can financial institutions do? So first of all, we have to think about awareness. Do financial institutions demonstrate that they have awareness of key issues, and in this example related to land? Do they, for example, know about the free prior informed consent and the rights of indigenous peoples? And do they conduct projects to understand and address these key issues? The second one is knowledge. Does the financial institution demonstrate measures or assessments, or does it report on these key issues in their own financial value chains? We can think of commitments. Does the financial institution commit to address land rights or tenure rights in their policies? Do they do strict screening and monitoring, which is vital? Supply chain management. So policy implementation should be conducted across the whole value chain. Does the financial institution require its clients to meet relevant standards, for example, FPIC, or do they engage with their clients on these issues? Transparency. Is the financial institution transparent about its financial portfolio? The insurance groups can and should be a lot more transparent with regard to their investment engagement processes. So do they, for example, write consent requirements into agreements with their clients to ensure that, for example, banks can publish corporate loans and project finance information? And the last one is grievance mechanisms. To ensure that stakeholder groups, including communities affected by financed projects and activities, also have access to grievance mechanisms. Next slide, please. So This slide is, I know it's very dense, and it's just to give you an overview that there are so many industry standards and, for example, banking sector standards out there. And I'm not going into detail about all of these, so you can look them up yourself if you're interested. But it's important to know that, for example, the RSPO principle and criteria prohibit any land acquisition without the free prior informed consent of local and indigenous communities. And these standards are very important to create a change in the world. Similar standards are there for the banking sector. So until recently, most banks argue that they themselves are not ultimately responsible for ensuring that their financing or related operations comply with human rights standards, including FPIC. However, the growing number of public campaigns that target these financial institutions on issues related to land grabs, for example, show that it's increasingly important as consumers and shareholders show that banks do address these issues. And just to mention, in the OECD guidance for responsible agricultural supply chains, you can also read how pension funds or banks can cause or be linked to adverse human rights impacts related to land. The last slide.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. Oh, you're on your last slide and you've just got 30 seconds to finish.
Yeah, I only need 30 seconds. Thanks. My last slide.
Great.
Yeah, this is the last slide. So this is an example on ANZ in Cambodia and the OECD guidelines. So in this example, cases against banks are brought in a country where the headquarters are. So the Australian NCP accepted a case for ANZ and its financing of a Cambodian sugar company connected to large-scale forced evictions and call for ANZ to develop a grievance mechanism. So between 2011 and 2014, ANZ loaned 40 million to a sugar company to establish a sugar plantation. So it was reported that in 2010, local communities and families were evicted from this land at gunpoint. So affected communities highlight that ANZ should not profit from a deal so closely connected to human rights abuses. The good thing is that, well, it took a very long time, but recently, as you can see on the slide, in February 2020, ANZ Bank has agreed to pay the revenue and interest earned on the loan given to the sugar company after the complaint was filed back in 2014 on behalf of 1,200 Cambodian families. I'll leave it there, and sorry for the very dense information.
No, thank you very much, Imke, and thank you for the 30-second wrap-up. Excellent, and a very interesting presentation. I'm sure people will have some questions, so just put them in the question and answer box there, and we'll get to them in the session when we grill Imke and Erin. Erin, I'm going to introduce from Grow Asia. She's our next speaker, and she's going to be talking about the ASEAN guidelines for responsible investing in food, agriculture, and forestry. Erin, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who might not know us yet, Grow Asia is a multi-stakeholder platform focused on improving livelihoods for smallholder farmers here in Southeast Asia. To date, we've reached 1.8 million smallholder farmers through our joint work with private, public, and civil society partners. And Grow Asia was catalyzed by the World Economic Forum in 2015. I'd like to say we're especially grateful for support for this project by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, ongoing support from DFAT, and partnership with the ASEAN Secretariat, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and the UN FAO. Next slide. ASEAN is primed for foreign and domestic investments in food, agriculture, and forestry. It's home to 15,000 plus agribusinesses that create market demand for the 1/6 of the population employed by agriculture. FDI in agriculture, food, and fisheries has grown steadily between 2012 and 2018, which poses a huge opportunity for this region. But that opportunity must be inclusive of all stakeholders involved and aim for equitable economic growth. The ASEAN economic community calls for competitive, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable growth in the sector in its 2025 vision for food, agriculture, and forestry. And in the face of crises like COVID-19, we need a regional set of guidelines to help boost investment and promote longer-term rewards and incentives for all. Next slide. My co-presenters today have already shared examples of ways in which financing can drive greater impact for local communities. This chart is a result of UNCTAD World Bank's earlier research in Asia interviewing stakeholders. Their findings showed that, in fact, positive outcomes from investments, such as employment, contract farming, and working conditions, outweigh the negative impacts related to displacement and land grabbing, as well as environmental degradation. Note that issues Imke just described were highlighted in these interviews as well. If investments are made with limited information or input from communities, they can have negative or unintended consequences. For example, an investor may have improved community water access by installing pumps, but may have simultaneously polluted water sources with poor agricultural practices. Next slide, please. To facilitate beneficial outcomes and mitigate the negative impacts of investments for stakeholders, GrowAsia and our partners developed this set of guidelines. Our goal is that the ASEAN Guidelines for Promoting Responsible Investment in Food, Agriculture, and Forestry, or the ASEAN RAI, can become the de facto framework for future investments in the region. The ASEAN RAI seek to ensure that investments along agri-value chains are sustainable and inclusive. The guidelines include 10 separate issue areas that investors should consider before, during, and after investments are made, which align with other international agri-sector topics as well. The guidelines benefit all stakeholders, investors, financiers, farming communities, civil society actors, and the public sector. The ASEAN RAI are applicable to investors along the value chain, such as demo farms and production facilities for input providers, mills and refineries for processors, packing plants for downstream players, and others. Next slide. So the advantages of the ASEAN RAI. They're aligned with the SDGs, which are at the core of many investors' existing commitments. They're applicable to investors with supply chains in multiple commodities and multiple Southeast Asian countries. They cover risks and opportunities related to any agri-commodity, forestry product, and/or food processing or manufacturing facility. They're based on internationally recognized standards set by the Committee for Food Security, but are contextualized to the unique challenges and opportunities in Southeast Asia. GrowAsia and our partners developed the language for the guidelines using feedback from over 250 comments from the region, including probably people on this call right now. We have license to operate within the public sector, as the ASEAN Ministers of Agriculture officially adopted the ASEAN RAI in 2018 and the Action Plan in 2019. And for now, the ASEAN RAI are non-binding, although they are to be integrated into national level investment policies, which provides longer term incentives for investors to align. Next slide, please. So how can RAI add value for the private sector while bringing positive impact to communities? GrowAsia conducted a series of interviews with 50+ partners in our network about the utility and applicability of the ASEAN RAI. They shared the following incentives for investors to adopt them. First, it's good business. You've already heard from my co-panelists how investments with sustainability targets boost profit and reduce risks. Second, governments are encouraging greater responsibilities, such as Indonesia's OJK regulations on sustainable finance. As the EU tightens restrictions, for example, investors will need greater transparency on what's happening along their supply chains. For now, responsible investments are nice to have, but as we've heard today, in the near future, they'll be required for license to operate. Responsible finance mechanisms. In 2019, we saw a rise in sustainability and ESG-linked loans, as JY and others described. The immediate incentive is the discounted interest rate available to them as long as the investment hits the sustainability KPIs. Fourth, it's an image booster. Companies can use responsible investments to differentiate themselves from other companies and attract younger talent who are often looking for ethical behavior from their potential employers. And lastly, for companies with existing certifications, like the ones Imke shared, or third-party ESG ratings, ASEAN RAI can provide regional legitimacy and alignment to tighter international policies. The majority of the ASEAN RAI principles are covered in those sector standards that Imke shared just now, and bankers are seeing competition among themselves in this field and are often willing to work with companies who are starting in their journey towards sustainability practices. Next slide, please. Partnerships are an essential ingredient in responsible investments, but must be based on mutual trust, tailored to individual contexts, have third-party funding to protect stakeholder independence, and involve local and national government. CSOs and NGOs can play a key role in achieving certain investment goals, such as increasing food security and keeping project stakeholders accountable. The ASEAN RAI provides specific roles for each of these stakeholder groups, and you can find more details on our website, which I'll share in a moment. GrowAsia and our partners now have a 10-year vision to implement the ASEAN RAI across the region, thanks to the direction from the ASEAN Secretariat and support from donors. Together, we've developed a 4-pillar plan. Pillar 1 is to integrate RAI into national policies through expert technical assistance in response to demand from member states. Pillar 2, we need a cadre of professionals who know how to apply these guidelines on the ground and can respond to stakeholder queries for future investments. For this, we'll create and run a 6-month blended learning program with ongoing mentorship for 400+ participants in the coming years. Pillar 3, at our regional events, we'll inspire uptake of the ASEAN RAI through capacity building workshops for farmers, communities, and NGOs at the national level, and through high-level conversations among private sector leadership around the region. And Pillar 4 will engage with private sector investors and support them to adopt the ASEAN RAI in very specific and tangible ways. We need metrics and indicators, of course, to measure our impact, but we will build upon existing frameworks so that the ASEAN RAI are accessible and simpler to adopt. Last slide. We've designed a program, therefore, to engage all the stakeholders that I mentioned, and we're rolling it out now. We will highlight companies and investors who are already implementing responsible business practices for addressing the lack of understanding and risk identification and management, as Christy talked about.
We invite get to the very end. Yeah, perfect. No, just in about 10 seconds would be great. Thank you.
We invite you to share your process and stories with us. We're also looking for investors and IHLs to develop the curriculum for the 6-month blended program, and we of course invite you to join our regional gatherings. And finally, we'll respond to requests for policy support from ASEAN member states. Next slide. We hope that you'll join us in the coming years. Thanks.
Excellent, and thank you, Erin, for that presentation. And it's really pleasing to see the emergence of a strong ASEAN approach in this area of work. So thank you for that. And I'm going to introduce, or actually I'm going to welcome back Imke. If you can come back and put yourself on screen, we would appreciate that with Erin. Welcome back, and thank you very much. Imke, I'll start with you to give Erin just a quick pause from her presentation. I have a question here around how important are grievance mechanisms in ensuring responsible investment, and where can companies find more information on this aspect and what is required?
Wow, that's a very broad question. So grievance mechanisms are very important for the local communities or the indigenous communities where negative impacts have materialized. So if you look, for example, for a bank, you can look at the IFC performance standards. They have their own grievance mechanisms, and you can look it up how they have developed that all. That's one way, one part. But you can also look at the reports that I just mentioned in the slide. We have like a whole section explaining on the grievance mechanisms. But it is really important that communities can, seek redress for the violations that occurred. So, and to achieve that, it's very important for investors to be transparent so that local communities know who is investing in their land. I can tell you it takes up to like 4 or 5 years to find out who is investing in a certain project. Sorry, I had to keep it short.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. That was a very good answer. Erin, I'll ask you a question now. How will GrowAsia and its partners work with agribusinesses across all the 10 ASEAN countries to help embed these RAI principles?
Great, thank you. So we will roll out the 4 areas of work that I described in 2 to 3 countries at a time, and those countries will be based on invitations that we receive to engage with ASEAN member states and private sector partners to work together. And some of those activities, like the regional events I mentioned, will be open to stakeholders from any country. So by 2030, our goal is that we've worked together with stakeholders in each agricultural exporting country in ASEAN and supported investors from all 10 member states.
Excellent, thank you for that. Imke, I have a question here around what is the definition of an indigenous community? Could you answer that?
Yes, so for us, the definition is that the indigenous community themselves identify themselves as being indigenous. And you can see in many countries, and this is one of the problems, that like there's like a whole database and that the government, for example, decides on who is indigenous or who is not. But in many African countries, for example, the whole country could be indigenous. So that's a very difficult definition. So we always say the communities themselves identify themselves as being indigenous, and they should be respected that way.
Excellent, thank you. Erin, how do the ASEAN RAI guidelines apply to SMEs and all local companies who have not yet maybe developed the sustainable resources or the staff internally to support the implementation?
Great, thanks. The ASEAN RAI were actually designed specifically to apply to investors at multiple scales. So that would include MNCs, domestic companies, and SMEs. And you can find the ways in which we would engage each of those stakeholder groups on our website. But we do understand that each investor will be at a different stage in adopting these types of practices. And since the ASEAN RAI are voluntary guidelines at this stage, we want to work with a diversity of companies to prepare them for those policy changes that are coming in the future, which means meeting them wherever they're at today. So more specifically, we'll be creating these case studies to show what responsible investing looks like in ASEAN, to have a sort of template for the specific regional context that we're in here. We'll also design tools to support investor companies to see how their existing certifications or commitments they might have already make them compliant with the ASEAN RAI. And we'll also work with investors to help them prioritize the 10 principles encapsulated in the ASEAN RAI according to their capacity and the level of risk. And then those investors can identify partners, and will often include their financial institution, to help them stay accountable and work toward those KPIs related to secondary responsibility targets. And I know that in the case of sustainability linked loans, there's often a sustainability coordinator that can support companies in that role. Thanks.
Excellent, thanks, Erin. Imke, back to you. Here's a lengthy question. How do we tackle situations where the government who issues land use rights, concession permits, for example, designates land for a particular use and that land is already used for another purpose by local communities? How does the company navigate free and prior informed consent while trying to stay in compliance with government regulation? Good question.
Yeah. So this is indeed a very difficult situation, which you see often happening, because there's this thing between financial investments and foreign direct investments, and inviting many companies and investors to your country, but also having people already living there. So through FPIC, you will identify what is the actual situation. So also as a company or as an investor, you would know, are there actually people living on these lands? And what do they expect? What do they know? Have they been engaged by the government? Will they get compensation? What are their rights? So you also know as a company or an investor, what are your risks, associated to this project? Because if there are people living, you know that there will be risks associated to the business that you will do. So you need to do your engagements, and you can also ask the government, but if there are people living here, what are their rights? Have they been informed? So, I mean, as a company or as an investor, you have a duty to care. You have to respect human rights, and FPIC is a human right, especially for indigenous. It is a human right for indigenous peoples, and through FPIC, you can also mitigate or prevent other human rights violations to occur. So it's just really important to treat this very carefully.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you for the answer. Erin, back to you. How are the RAI ASEAN specific rather than globally relevant?
Great question. And so as I mentioned, the ASEAN RAI were developed and based upon the International Committee for Food Security's principles for responsible investing in agriculture and food systems. But the ASEAN Secretariat specifically wanted a greater focus in the ASEAN RAI on 3 key areas. One is a focus on the role of technology and technology adoption in terms of being able to communicate, say, with communities that are separated because they're on islands or because of a lack of internet connection. So coming up with creative ways of using different types of technology, as well as a focus on climate change adaptation and mitigation, given the challenges that we're seeing are all around us in Southeast Asia right now around climate change. And for example, as sea levels rise, that will significantly impact certain investments. So looking at those specific impacts. And then the last area is a specific focus on the regional approach of the guidelines. So encouraging national governments to work together as they develop those policy frameworks, which Grow Asia and IISD will help them to do. And so we want to encourage that cooperation and that regional approach, as well as the home state's own connections to their outgoing investors and inward investors, and being able to facilitate greater dialogue through the regional entity. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Erin. Imke, another question we had, are there examples of model clauses written that set out human rights commitments, including FPIC commitments, which enterprises can use to insert into their contracts with clients?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I don't know why. Yes, there are plenty of examples of these kind of, yeah, there are many. So I'm very happy to provide those if people are interested.
Excellent, thank you. Erin, how will activities after COVID-19, activities in the ASEAN RAI plan or project be affected by COVID-19?
Yeah, it's a very timely and important question. And we just had a meeting with our project partners last week about this, and all of us felt that we will continue forward on the work streams that we have already planned to start, but we'll be very thoughtful and cognizant of the different challenges that each national and local context are facing as a result of COVID, with, for example, closure around exports, or challenges that smallholders are facing with accessing technical extension or access to credit right now. So we will be very careful to integrate those challenges into all of our approaches, and we'll also be more thoughtful about ways that we're engaging with our partners. So we might use video cams to do interviews for our case studies, for example, and ask people to use different types of technology to facilitate that process. And more broadly, we'll also be continuing to work at the international level to share the learnings from ASEAN out to the international scale, so that those learnings can also be applied in other countries where COVID is having a huge impact on agriculture and food systems. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Erin. I have a question here for you, Imke. What commodity is recorded highest or is most prevalent in land grab violations? It's quite a specific question.
It is. So as you can read in the report from Global Witness last year, it was that year specifically that the agribusiness sector has taken over from the mining sector in being the deadliest sector for land rights defenders to defend their land. And well, I don't know which commodity is most risky, but it of course relates to the country where it is in, and whether we are talking about very large scale land acquisitions where people have been living, and how human rights are respected in that specific country. I know from my own work experience that like the sectors like sugar and palm oil are very risky, but there are so many context specific things related to it, so that's why you need a very good risk assessment.
Excellent, thanks, Imke. Erin, here's a question on what other roles, or what roles do cooperatives have in implementing the RAI or working with the RAI principles?
Yeah, great question. And several of our civil society partners have already been working on this across Southeast Asia, and for several years in some cases. So the Asia DRAW national chapters, as well as the Asian Farmers Association, which represent farmer cooperatives and organizations. So our project, again, that's funded by SDC, will be collaborating with those groups and others who have direct connections to cooperatives. And in terms of the specific role, certainly we would look to cooperatives to provide leadership from responses that farmers have about the impact, but hopefully we actually get to hear from them before those investments are actually made, such that we are able to understand what challenges and opportunities that farming community is facing, and so that the investor can be very aware of that when setting up their own goals around sustainable or responsible practices during the investment.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Erin, and thank you, Imke. That is the end of your specific question and comment section. So thank you very much for all your detailed responses to people's questions. And I'm now going to welcome back our other panelists that presented today. So if we just go back one slide, Brina. Excellent. So if the other speakers could put on their videos, we can see all of you. Erin, Imke, JY, and Christy is joined us there. Thank you very much for coming back. We've got lots of questions for you. I guess the first question that we have is one for all of you to give us a few thoughts on, a few brief thoughts. And this is, do you think the finance sector is currently doing enough to support responsible agribusiness? And if you could name one action that it could improve on, what would it be? And I'm going to start off with Erin, actually. Lucky first.
Great, thank you. I'll be very curious to hear JY and others' comments on this one, but I'll just say that we've been having more conversations lately with financiers in our network that are looking for clients with responsible commitments or backgrounds, histories. But we would love to see those financiers challenging more clients to adopt sustainability or responsibly focused KPIs, perhaps even by making their own internal commitments as a bank that are based on positive impact rather than only focusing on risk mitigation. So rather than having these kinds of high-risk sectors that banks will identify that they commit not to invest in, we'd like to see a greater number of banks having high-impact portfolios by looking at the kinds of impact investors that, the impact indicators that a lot of impact investors already use, coming from places like the Impact Management Project or IRIS Plus. And saying that, we know that financiers also face stiff competition and don't want to lose out on deals because their standards are too high. So we'll be curious to find out how other stakeholders can support them in meeting this goal.
Excellent, thanks, Erin. Imke?
Yeah, I will keep it short. I think a lot has changed in the sector for better than if you look at in the past. But no, for me, I think it's not enough. Much more can be done. And one thing I would say to focus on is transparency. So I think the financial sector should become more transparent about where they're financing, what projects they're financing, in which portfolio they invest, so that they also can get like real feedback on the projects that they invest in. So it's also part of their own monitoring, but also for communities that they can like find redress and know who is financing their projects.
Excellent, thanks, Imke. JY?
It's a good point. I mean, the short answer is no, definitely. I think everyone can do more. The financial sector is a key drivers. I think access to funding is very important. I think to give an example, for instance, on the ESG loan, it's good that we start somewhere, meaning that we start seeing more deals, and we see the evolution on the ESG linked loan. It will take just 1 minute, but if you give an example, what will happen if a client does not achieve a target, right? What's the discount will go, right? And there's some engaging new discussions to evolve the product to say, well, if I don't achieve the goal, me as a lenders, can we use that funding to fund some sustainable projects? So at least we still achieve a goal in the way how we conceptualize the incentive. And this is a great thing to evolve in that way, because the spirit of the sustainability link financing is moving in a great direction, for instance.
Excellent, thanks, JY. Christy?
Yeah, the benefit of going last is I can say, I agree, those are all. But I do agree. I mean, I do think finance can do more. That's one of the reasons why we're working on this green project, is because I do think they can do more. The sustainability commitments can definitely be tied more to financial incentives, the transparency. And I like the comment about the risk aversion and starting to think about not what you can't do, but what you can do. And how do you then think a little bit more creatively with different partners? The things around like the club loans, where you have multiple financiers coming in to help take risk, to help, we talked about blended finance. How can we use those mechanisms to support those businesses that are leading the way in terms of sustainable practices to help kind of build up that body of cases that everyone turns to and says, where are they? And therefore say, here they are.
Excellent, thanks, Christy. Erin and Christy, I'm going to ask you a question, which I think might be better answered by both of you. How can the finance sector better connect with farmers to better understand what happens on farm and the barriers there to more sustainable practices?
Christy, I can give you first chance at this one.
I'll start with Christy, yes, because Christy went last time.
I mean, I think you have to, part of it's thinking about what size of bank are we talking about and where is that bank really located? I mean, there are, I think structurally it's hard for some to get to the farmer level. That's why they turn to programs like USAID Green Invest Asia to help them kind of connect and understand better what's happening at the farmer level. So that's certainly one way, is to work through local partners that can kind of help give a sense of what's happening with the farmers. I think potentially another way is if as regional banks is, you know, making sure that people do go and visit their clients regularly as possible, would also benefit, not kind of relying on kind of third-party reporting. But at the same time, I think also increasingly looking at technology and how to use technology better as a way for farmers to interact and engage with their banks or with their financiers. And we see a lot of new technologies and interesting things coming out about being able to monitor and connect with farmers that way.
Excellent. And Erin, briefly?
Yeah, I absolutely echo what Christy said. And the only things I would add are just that banks could also, particularly I think regional and local banks, have a real opportunity to work with government extension workers, who are people that are out interacting with farmers on a daily basis, maybe using more technology right now because of COVID, but leveraging those types of opportunities with the private sector, as well as making an effort to attend the kinds of events that a lot of our agribusiness partners are already attending, hosted by organizations like Grow Asia, like AFA, like the ASEAN Secretariat, like Green Invest Asia, to learn more about exactly how to get this kind of information and to hear directly from our staff that are based in the field.
Excellent, thanks, Erin. Imke, I'm going to start with you, and then I'll move to JY and perhaps Erin and then Christy. This is a question that actually, JY, you may have seen this before. I'm not sure, but this was a question around the amount of standards and requirements and guidance out there that different different investors have to take into account. And Imke, I saw there was quite a big list as well on your slide. How do investors make sense of all the different guidance documents and standards out there, and how do they choose which ones to use? And JY, I'll ask you that question afterwards, and perhaps Christy. Imke.
Yeah, so I will limit myself now to solely on the issue of FPIC, the free prior informed consent. And that's also why we as Oxfam say commit to the highest standard of free prior informed consent for all communities, because then you don't have all these different ways of working. You know, you don't have like if the situation is A or B or C or D, then we have to apply this or this or this or this. Just go for the highest standards and secure the rights of people. So do the whole process and do it well. So if you can see, for example, the IFC performance standards or the Equator principles, they all have these like specific requirements, and in this situation this, in this situation this. Just make sure if you have an investment somewhere or if you're investing in a company, let them uphold to the highest standards, and that's like FPIC for, and in this case for land rights, FPIC for indigenous peoples and local communities. Make sure that they are consulted, make sure that they have a voice, make sure that they can give their consent or project yes or no, because if there are issues, if there are conflicts, you want to know if you're going to invest there. And that's the way to find out.
Excellent, thanks, Imke. JY?
No, I think yes. It's really difficult, right? When you sit from the banks, right? There's so many options in terms of standards. I think that yes, a conservative approach is to rely on, I mean, the safest conservative standards for you to rely on, and also being specific for the, I would say, the standards which is meaningful for your case. And this come along together with knowing customers, knowing the environment, the ecosystem of your lenders, and how it can be also practical, right? And of course, if you take example of the palm oil, you have the RSPO, the ISPO, and the MSPOs. It can be really confusing sometimes. But also you need to sit down with your clients and understand, well, what's the best standard to work with as well.
Excellent, thanks, JY. Christy?
I'm not sure I have much to add, but you know, I certainly from JY's comments resonate with me from what I've heard. That is complex and complicated with the banks. You know, I hear about you know, different silos. You know, this tranche of money only applies for these standards, but then this tranche of money applies to these standards. It does make you wonder, why can't there just be kind of, as MK was saying, you know, at the highest level? But again, there are different commodity standards that then also have to be adhered to. So it is, you know, quite complex, and it's perhaps not as simple an easy answer as we would like.
Excellent, thank you.
Alyssa, can I jump in with a teaser?
Yes, go for it.
GrowAsia just completed a report that will roll out later this year that actually demonstrates the alignment between 11 agri-sector standards and 5 investment or finance sector standards with the ASEAN RAI, and then goes into a lot of detail about how those alignments can help companies make decisions based on commitments they may have already made, and see how well they're already aligning to other standards. So watch out for that.
Excellent, and thanks for the teaser. We'll be waiting for that. That'll be very interesting, actually. So thank you for that. And I have a question for you, Erin, and others. Most times these discussions around responsible investment involve governments and large investors. How can we raise small investors or consumers' awareness on the importance of investing responsibly?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I think that it really ends up being that there are so many different actors in this space, whether they be private sector, public sector, civil society, farmer groups, that are all working toward increasing consumer awareness. So it's kind of I think you have to hope that that ocean of work that we're all contributing to will help raise up awareness slowly and over time. I will say that the experience with COVID right now is helping raise a lot of consumer awareness about where your food does or might not come from. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. Imke, just quickly.
Yeah, quickly. I think it's a good thing to consult the Fair Finance Guide, because that's really a thing to engage with consumers to see, hey, where's my bank or my insurance company? Where are they investing? How are their policies? And also shows cases where it goes well or where it goes wrong.
Excellent. Thank you. JY?
I think it's come again to education's point of how you can help consumers understanding where you're sitting, right? And maybe one way to understand it is taking a risk approach, right? If you can help investors, regardless of the level of understanding the risk that sustainability is getting into it, it can probably help them to raise awareness. Excellent.
Thank you. Christy?
Yeah, I think I forget all the authors, but there was a report that was released maybe a couple months ago, the Asia Food Challenge. I think it was Rabobank and Tomahawk, another author. But I thought that they had a couple of really interesting points sort of around this, that at least in Asia, yes, maybe consumer awareness now is a little low. However, Asia has like an incredibly young population, and they're very socially conscious, increasingly socially conscious, and have increasing buying power. And that the projection was that you actually will start to see as these consumers mature, they will bring these kind of sustainability interests and around food safety and around things like their lessons right now around coronavirus into their buying decisions, which will then kind of be reflected in the market and therefore where people are investing. And so kind of a bit of an advance warning to investors now, think about where your consumers are going, because that's where you want to be.
Excellent. Thanks, Christy. And thank you to all of you for taking part in this panel discussion. It's been very interesting. We actually have lots of questions that we can't ask you, but just for all of you that have provided questions, we will try and follow up later, Grow Asia and OECD on those questions. So don't worry, they're not going nowhere. We will follow up. Imke, did you have something to say? Just briefly?
Very briefly, just to say what Christy was saying is absolutely right, because research has shown that millennials are twice as likely to invest in companies with a good social reputation. So I think that's a good sign for the future.
Excellent, and that's a great way to end it too. So thank you very much for taking part in our panel discussion. We're going to move on to our very last speaker of the webinar, and that is Barbara Belajic from OECD Centre for Responsible Business Conduct, where she is the financial sector lead. So welcome, Barbara.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for those very interesting presentations. I'm going to do my best just to summarize and underscore some key takeaways in the remaining couple of minutes we have left, and just give you a little bit of an overview of the work that we're doing on responsible business conduct in the financial sector within the OECD. So I think the first main takeaway is that responsible investment and finance are very much on the rise. And a few drivers for this were mentioned. We're seeing a lot of demand for beneficiaries, which will grow. It was mentioned, millennials particularly demand a lot of ESG products, but also demand from the public and regulators for financial institutions to really understand and report on environmental and social issues associated with their activities. And this was discussed a little bit less, but we're also seeing that there is a strong business case for responsible investment in finance. At the OECD, we're collecting increasing evidence that shows that responsible companies are often also associated with enhanced creditworthiness and higher risk-adjusted returns in the context of equity. So we heard a little bit about how financial institutions are responding to this trend and demand in the context of lending and investment activities in the agricultural sector. Particularly innovative approaches and products were discussed. Sustainability-linked loans were discussed by several participants. These, of course, are loans where interest rates are dependent on sustainability performance and thus incentivize responsible behavior. We also heard from speakers about several models and products that they've been developing to drive capital to important areas of the sector that might normally have issues accessing financing, such as smallholders and the missing middle. And in addition to innovative products, we also heard how financial institutions are taking steps to really integrate environmental and social issues into their internal risk management systems. And the importance of transparency and how financial institutions are doing this was really underscored as well. Particularly banks are really becoming sophisticated in how they measure and report on carbon emissions across their portfolios. The issue of FPIC and land rights is a particular risk area in the sector. So we noted the importance of banks really paying attention to this and engaging with their clients to communicate on their expectations around land rights and FPIC, and then also report on this publicly. And also, and I think that this is new for some financial institutions, we heard a lot about the importance of cooperating with stakeholder groups in risk mitigation. So I wanted to close just by briefly highlighting what the OECD is doing on these issues, because a lot of these approaches are also ones that we recommend in our own standards. If we could go to the next slide quickly. So in 2015, we launched our work on responsible business conduct in the financial sector. The objective of this work is really to explain what recommendations in the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises mean for different types of financial service providers, and also to develop practical approaches for how investors and banks can carry out due diligence to identify, respond to, and report on environmental and social impacts in their portfolios. We've already published guidance for institutional investors. Notably, this past year, the EU introduced a regulation which will require EU investors to report on their due diligence processes in line with this guidance. So some of these recommendations have now been codified in EU regulation. In 2019, we also published guidance for general corporate lending transactions, And this is significant because we've seen in the context of commercial banks that a lot of them have very sophisticated processes associated with project finance activities. But when it comes to general corporate lending, when loans are given at a corporate level, the systems are a lot less defined and ambitious. And these financing transactions represent sort of the bulk of debt and credit activity of banks. So this was a big gap that we were seeking to fill. This year, we'll also be finalizing a guidance on project and asset-based transactions. Through this work, we're really seeking to level the playing field, make sure that the same standards apply to all financial service providers. And we're also thinking about how to drive complementarity between due diligence approaches of corporates and financial institutions so that these processes can be better streamlined. Maybe, I know we're 1 minute over, just 30 seconds, just to touch on 2 substantive points. In our work in the banking and investment sectors, we've noticed that there's kind of 2 areas of the due diligence processes that are quite still challenging for financial institutions, and that is stakeholder engagement, which was discussed a little bit during the presentations, and remediation. Stakeholder engagement obviously is extremely important in the context of agriculture and project finance activity. We developed guidance on stakeholder engagement, how it relates to due diligence processes for the extractive sector several years back. And I think that there's some good cross-cutting recommendations there that could also be relevant to agriculture and financiers of the agricultural sector. And the second point, remediation, there's been a lot of discussion in the past years to what extent banks may or may not be responsible for contributing to remediation where their clients cause human rights or environmental impacts. We discussed this a lot in the context of our general corporate lending paper, and also thought a lot about kind of what constitute appropriate grievance mechanisms for banks to handle these complaints and make sure they're aware of them. So we'll be having a global forum, a virtual global forum on responsible business conduct on June 17th, where we'll be looking specifically at the issue of remediation, and we'll be having a session specifically on the role of financial institutions in remediation and taking a closer look at the ANZ case that was mentioned by one of the speakers, and which is a very interesting and innovative example of how a bank actually contributed to remediating impacts caused by one of their clients. So I know we're over time. I'll close there, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and for the excellent summary of the key points of today's webinar and for those additional resources and the teaser for the June meeting as well. It's greatly appreciated. I'd just like to thank all the speakers myself and also you, the audience, for your participation today. Thank you for holding on to 3 minutes past. I'll just hand over to Erin Sweeney from Grow Asia just to close the session with a few words. Erin.
Thank you. So we will follow up with you immediately after the webinar with a short survey, and thanks for your time to fill that out. We will also share the slides and recording of the webinar with you within the next 1 week, so you can look forward to that. I'd like to extend a special thanks to Women in Agribusiness Asia, or WOMAG, our event partner, for supporting the event, as well as to the funders of Grow Asia and OECD projects. And we're very grateful to OECD for welcoming us as co-hosts in their webinar series. As Grow Asia and our partners continue our work on the ASEAN RAI, we hope to engage with many of you and introduce you to new partners. So maybe we'll even get to see you in person at our events later this year. Thank you all so much again for your time and attention, and have a great night.